All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you on this beautiful night to. I normally say come out, but come inside to in front of your screen to hear from Ambassador John Koenig. And I will introduce Ambassador Koenig in just a minute. But first, I wanted to. I see some familiar names and faces, but we're the World Affairs Council of Tacoma, and our mission is to promote events that promote international awareness and global understanding. And so this certainly fits our bill because we have one of the people who's been helping to carry out US foreign policy for the last 30 years and is now teaching about it. Helping me tonight will be Professor Edgar Uhr from the University of Washington, Tacoma. I'm John Lucas from Pierce College, Puyallup. We've been having a monthly series focused on US foreign policy, and this is our last event of the year. And so we'll be starting up again in September, but we also have for those of you who are interested in our book club, that's going to be on June 24th. And they're going to be reading a book, A Holy Cow by Sarah McDonald. And so the details are on our website if you're interested in joining for that. But tonight I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing John Koenig. He's a longtime American diplomat. He served in the Foreign Service for 25 years in Europe and in the Mediterranean. And part of that included he served as the US ambassador to Cyprus from 2012 to 2015. And currently he is teaching classes on US foreign policy at the University of Washington in Seattle. And of course, perhaps most important to us, he's born and raised in Tacoma. So we always love that. But before I turn it over to Ambassador Koenig, let me ask all of you to mute yourselves during the talk so that if a dog runs into the room or a plane flies over, it doesn't interrupt his talk. And if you have questions, type them into the chat room. And Etka will be monitoring the chat and will be in charge of posing the most pertinent of the questions to Ambassador Koenig after his presentation. So as things strike you as interesting or things you want to weigh in on, just type it into the chat and we can see if we can put Ambassador Koenig on the spot after his presentation. And right now, let me turn it over to John Koenig and hear his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I want to thank you and Marcia, of course, and the World Affairs Council of Tacoma for inviting me here to speak this evening. And also to everybody here on the screen, thank you very much for joining this conversation. I am going to put up a PowerPoint. And one second here. And hopefully it'll work well. And start with this slide. Just one second, I'm just getting the slideshow started. Come on, good. Yeah, this is the picture you may have noticed that's behind me. And I'm starting with this slide. First of all, because I'm very proud to be from Tacoma. And this is a slide that demonstrates that. I, was in the Foreign Service for over 30 years, and I spent almost that entire time outside the United States. But this is what it was all about for me. I took this picture out on Commencement Bay with my sister and her family on the 4th of July, 2017. And I grew up on boats in Puget Sound and up in the San Juan Islands with my family. And we saw a lot of orcas and things, but I never saw anything remotely like this ever in Commencement Bay. This was a humpback whale that was breaching between Vashon and Point Defiance for quite a while on the 4th of July 4 years ago. So I just show it to kind of underscore how attached I am to this part of the world and to this home sea of mine, even though I'm going to actually talk about another body of water and another sea that I care a lot about. But I would like to start with a little discussion about a debate I think that's underway right now in about American foreign policy, and one in which I'm kind of a partisan. I believe in one side of this debate. This is the debate about realism and restraint and other schools of thought in American foreign policy. So this slide shows a map of the countries in the world where the US is either militarily engaged or has bases or something like that. It shows the situation from a couple of years ago, but I don't think the real situation has changed much. I share it purely as an illustration of just how extensive in 2021 our overseas military commitments are. Naturally, if you were to color in the United States, it would look like even more of the globe. Foreign policy based on close adherence to national interest has always been called realism, as far as I know. And as a student of foreign affairs and a practitioner for 3 decades as a diplomat, realism was the foundation of my work. But for the last 20 years, there has been relatively little discussion about realism in American foreign policy debates, especially in public debates. And it seemed at times as though the idea was almost dead. Our ambitions, our policies were very ambitious, but they were generally not successful. They were, for the most part, failing. But we never seemed to ask the really serious, tough questions about what was going on. Those were questions mainly about national interest. What was the national interest? How do we define a policy in line with national interest? So we saw threats all around us, and we reached for a lot of military solutions. We were quite ideological and quite wedded to purported American exceptionalism, and we left way too many decisions to so-called experts in foreign policy and national security establishment. So foreign policy realism at that time seemed to have fallen out of favor for most of my career, to be perfectly honest, at least beginning in the 1990s and into the more recent years. It was blamed for a lot of excesses. It was a term that was used sort of pejoratively to describe things like arming and assisting the Saudis in their attacks on the Houthis in the civil war in Yemen. It was often used as a kind of pejorative idea. And even where critics came in and criticized what was purported to be realism or American policy, they typically focused on the sort of moral dimension of our failures. You know, and many people would describe the Iraq invasion as somehow morally wrong, and indeed it was, but they would focus more on the moral dimension. True realism during these years, and they were long years, had relatively few supporters in the policy debate. Many of them were libertarians, and they had rather little influence on public policy. And because realists always balance human rights and other kinds of values interests against other, sometimes more tangible interests, these realists were subject to a lot of criticism, just as much criticism as I would say as neocons and others who actually had a highly, I guess, moralistic approach to foreign affairs. So at the same time as this was going on in the policy debate, my colleagues, many of my colleagues in the foreign policy community in Washington were enthusiastically supporting this. They would very much want the US to take on more and more commitments internationally, including in the security and defense realm, and to draw more and more red lines, to be more and more assertive in our foreign policy vis-a-vis so-called rivals. I'm happy to say, though, that I think realism is making quite a comeback now in the discussion of foreign policy. And this is mainly, in my view, in response to the hugely complex challenge of dealing with China's rise and also with certain developments in the Middle East, which have made our position there more and more doubtful. If I were to choose a point in time at which this debate began to shift, I guess I would choose the publication of Graham Allison's very famous book about America, China, and the so-called Thucydides trap, called Destined for War, with a question mark, which came out in 2017. But this kind of led people to ask more and more about the risks of American foreign policy and to take the issue of national interest back to where it belongs, a definition of vital interest. This is not an easy task, by the way. It's not really easy to settle or reach an agreement on defining precisely what is the national interest, let alone vital national interest. But we really do need to consider all of these things and discuss this much more forthrightly and honestly with each other in order to get back to a more credible and more sustainable foreign policy. So in this discussion now, I think I've seen that what was termed realism for many years, which is sort of a cynical approach to international affairs, is no longer being sort of treated that way, that we're now engaged in something that's more like an open, inquisitive search for America's proper place in a changing world. That's grounded in the very basic idea that foreign and security policy, just like any other field of public policy, exists to serve the interests of the American people. So this is a debate that's very much underway. I'm very pleased to see that it's being pushed forward more strongly now. I would say I'm also a little bit on one side of the realists. I'm a person who advocates restraint. This is a idea that is mostly associated with certain scholars affiliated with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. There are several of them who are quite famous, but the idea behind this is kind of the philosophical counterpart to realism in terms of analysis. So analysis, the realism is the analytical approach, and restraint is the philosophical approach. And using these together, I think we can find new ways to see America's role in the world and how to face what are admittedly very, very serious international challenges. Here's a map of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the announcement of this event, it was noted that the Eastern Mediterranean produces a lot of headlines and crises. It produces a lot of news. We've seen that even this recent month with what's happened in between the Israelis and the Palestinians over Jerusalem and the attacks from Gaza and the retribution or retaliation by Israel. But we also need to bear in mind, I think, that even though the Eastern Mediterranean overlaps with the Middle East, it is in fact a somewhat distinct region with its own dynamic. And just to go through what's happened in the Eastern Mediterranean over the past decade, we've seen civil wars in Syria and Libya, and these wars have created humanitarian crises on Europe's doorstep that have actually strongly influenced political developments in European states. The Islamic State, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, surged to prominence in Syria and Iraq until it was beaten back by the United States and others not very long ago. Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas still cause a great deal of mischief in the Eastern Mediterranean region. Russia has increased its foothold in Syria and has meddled very openly in Libya. Natural gas and related disputes over offshore resources have led to pretty serious confrontation involving Turkey, other regional states, Cyprus, Greece, Israel, and even France, which has decided to take a leading role in the response. The Israel-Palestine peace process has not moved, though there were advances in relations between Israel and some Arab states, the so-called Abraham Accords. And this past month, of course, we unfortunately saw the resumption of violence in that conflict. Cyprus remains divided, host to the United Nations' oldest peacekeeping mission. As often, Lebanon is riven by conflict and subject to very intense foreign interference, and oppressive authoritarian regimes have cracked down on political opponents and human rights in general in Syria, Egypt, and Turkey. So kind of in sum, the Eastern Mediterranean is a very messy region. It is a mess, I would say, if you look at it from the outside. Over this same period, the past decade, the US has gradually withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean, sort of haphazardly. In Libya, we famously led from behind. I was very actively involved in that mission. We led from behind in the NATO bombing campaign and quietly condoned the overthrow of Gaddafi without any intention to fill the security void left behind. In Syria, the US started out with a bold rhetorical policy on Assad's removal from power, but we never found an effective way to work with the Arab opposition. Instead, we invested heavily in an effective partnership with Kurdish forces that we later sold out to Turkey. In Egypt, we helped nudge Mubarak from power, but then stood by as the Muslim Brotherhood abused its position. and was ousted in a military takeover by General Sisi, who then clamped down on human rights and cracked down on freedoms. As for the confrontation over natural gas, the US has a clear legal position on Eastern Mediterranean offshore resources, but we don't back it up with anything beyond some diplomatic intervention. We are happy in this case to let the Europeans take the lead. America has been more or less a bystander in the Libyan civil war. Here too, we have left the situation to others, from European mediators to Russian, Turkish, and Arab meddlers. Our policy on the Israel-Palestine dispute has tilted more toward Israel in recent years, perhaps until the election of President Biden, but no serious effort has been made to resolve the underlying conflict. Overall, then, what we have is a picture of a region where turmoil persists and occasionally spikes, while America gradually withdraws and loses influence. That would normally be my cue to tell you that the US needs to engage more energetically in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is just the classic setup for that kind of pitch. That is what I'm hearing from a wide array of pundits and so-called experts. It is what members of the foreign policy establishment, which I used to belong to, are expected to promote. It is what the prominent former US government official Eric Edelman proposes in a December 2020 paper for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which he entitled Defending Forward America's Interests, an interesting choice of words, America's Interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is what the Center for Policy Analysis, another Washington-based think tank, has advocated just last month. It's what everyone is calling for. I just was on a Zoom conference sponsored by the German Marshall Fund last week with a lot of senior colleagues who I very much respect, and they were doing exactly the same thing. They were telling me and the world that the United States needs to get vastly more engaged with this part of the world. We always need to have roadmaps and action plans, and most of all, we need American leadership, as they would put it. I don't agree, but let me just say that this was most notable last month during the uptick in violence, very, very serious violence in Gaza and adjacent parts of Israel. Long-term Middle East hand Martin Indyk said this, and this is kind of a classic line from this approach. You can turn your back on the Middle East, but it won't turn its back on you. Well, that is an interesting way to look at it, but what about the violence that we're talking about, the outbreak of violence among Palestinians and Israelis? What about that was a challenge to the United States? Just exactly what? I respect Martin Indyk, but it is irresponsible to suggest that the US must remain deeply engaged in a region as long as it remains turbulent and its conflicts remain unresolved. We have choices. I mean, what is the value of being a powerful state in the position we are in if we have no choices, if we are entirely the slaves of external events? In the past, our choices often exacerbated problems in this region and damaged American interests. But we can say this is not our problem, and I think we can fairly say that about what's going on right now. We have choices. We can make better choices now. And America's disengagement from the Eastern Mediterranean is the right choice in my view. I spent 20 years working on this region, and I know it better than most. Nevertheless, the effect on, and we have this very, very sad history of the past decade, but the actual impact on vital American interests of all of this toil and trouble in the Eastern Mediterranean over the last decade has been negligible. You might even say zero in many cases. Edelman and his co-author claim they are defining American interests in the region, but really, I don't see it. For them and many others, it boils down simply to this. The Eastern Mediterranean is fraught with conflict and potential flashpoints, and that is true. We have friends there, and we're traditionally the leading power there. That is also true. Now others are asserting their role in this region with disregarding American interests. True. But then they conclude that we therefore need to put the US and US forces back smack in the middle of things in order to establish greater control over the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean once again. I don't agree. By their logic, wherever China and Russia go, the US must go to counter them. Wherever there is a problem, the US must be present to manage it. That is not That is the opposite of realism. That is reactionism. And in my view, the problem with our disengagement from this region, the Eastern Mediterranean, is not that it has happened, but that we have not said about it deliberately enough as we should. From here on in, we should make a clear priority of rebalancing and reducing our activity to the few remaining matters that really demand our active involvement in support of American interest. The foreign policy establishment likes to throw around a very loosely defined and expansive notion of national interest. We have seen this repeatedly in harsh arguments over the past decade, which are often sort of imbued with the sense that the United States is the decision maker about everything. We saw it in the connection with the Arab Spring and Israel and the expanding role of Russia and China in places like Syria and Libya and the Middle East. The arguments about Syria and Libya were particularly harsh in the United States between policy wonks. We saw it again last month in a discussion about violence between Israel and Palestinians. In their telling, everything is an imperative. The US always must act. They use this language all the time, out of some moral obligation or grand strategic calculation. But wait, that's just not true. We have choices, and we need to start making better choices. We need to start setting priorities and following these priorities. The opposite, what they are advocating, what we have generally been doing over the past, let's say, 2.5 to 3 decades, is, in my view, just demonstration of a predilection to grandiosity and interventionism, and it has cost us dearly. There is a better way to approach world problems. I mentioned the Quincy Institute. They're kind of famous for having a different approach. But this new approach, this new realism, is actually being picked up broadly, including by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is about as establishment a think tank as you can possibly imagine. In a recent paper published by the Council on Foreign Relations, Bob Blackwell and Phil Zelikow examined our China policy and the risks of a US-China military confrontation over Taiwan. And naturally, there's no more important issue for the United States strategically than how to manage, not necessarily win, but how to manage our relations with China in the 21st century. Still, Blackwell and Zelikow begin very soberly, very modestly, by taking a hard look at what are vital US interests in the context of Taiwan and the situation in the Western Pacific. And they walk right back to the source, to the most fundamental principles of national interest. Essentially, you might say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness right out of our founding documents for America and Americans. They conclude, even in this very fraught atmosphere of so-called great power competition and global confrontation, that the US does not have a direct vital interest in the preservation of Taiwan's autonomy, but instead has a vital interest in defending Japan and South Korea, our treaty allies, and in preserving America's ability to influence events in the Western Pacific more broadly. This, I think, is the kind of analysis we need to use when we look at the Eastern Mediterranean and other regions. So, to inform this discussion, I just want to take a quick run through how I see our interests evolving over the past, let's say, 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And this might actually go back even into the Cold War, so let's say back 40 years. During the Cold War, this region, the Eastern Mediterranean, was contested by the Soviet Union, which was a peer competitor, the only other superpower, and one that was an explicit rival to the United States. Now, once again, a much less threatening Russia, a much less powerful Russia, is contesting the Eastern Mediterranean, along with China and Turkey and other powers, so that the US position there is tested and contested. During the Cold War, NATO was vitally important to the United States and to our overall strategic well-being because, and the Greece-Turkey rivalry and tension, including regarding Cyprus, threatened to split the alliance and weaken the southern flank. Today, Greece-Turkey-Cyprus tensions are very, very high, and they have the potential to cause conflict, which is a cause for concern. But the southern flank of NATO was totally transformed by NATO enlargement, and NATO itself is much less relevant to US vital national interests than it was back during the Cold War. perhaps even less important than it was, let's say 10 years ago when we used NATO as one of the main ways to muster forces for our alliance and coalition operations in Iraq and Iran, or Iraq and Afghanistan. During the Cold War, Israel faced existential threats from its Arab neighbors and fought 3 major wars. Today, Israel is not seriously threatened by its Arab neighbors, though it remains deeply concerned about Iran. And the recent violence does not really change that picture. During the Cold War, the flow of energy through the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East oil in general was of vital interest to the United States and our European allies. Today, those resources are very much less important to the United States and Europe, and they're of diminishing importance over time. So this energy link is much less relevant to our national interest. And during the Cold War, the Eastern Mediterranean was the major source of international terrorism against American and European targets. Today, that threat is much reduced, and at the same time, we have other serious threats to address, including domestic terrorism, malicious cyber activity by non-state and state actors. So what, in my view, are the vital national interests of the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean? This is my list, and it's really short. I think we still would have a vital interest in avoiding Greece-Turkey conflict because it would have potentially grave consequences for NATO and the entire structure of the Atlantic Alliance system. So this calls for a modest role in forestalling and managing crises that emerge in the relationship, and perhaps more. This is one area where we might invest a little of diplomacy. Second, I think supporting the defense of Israel from existential threats is an abiding interest of the United States for strong historical and moral reasons. So this calls for continued US-Israel defense, security, and intelligence cooperation. But as Stephen Walt, a man I greatly admire, points out in an article that was published, I think, just in the last day or two in Foreign Policy, it would be beneficial to have a more normal, less special relationship between the United States and Israel. And third, containing and countering the terrorist threat from the Eastern Mediterranean remains an American interest. So this calls for maintaining a limited presence on the ground and the capacity to respond in a timely and robust fashion if events warrant. But that's it in my view, just these 3. It's not that everything else is unimportant, it's that it does not touch on truly vital national interest. That includes a lot of bad stuff in which we should not be disinterested. It leaves out the Libyan and Syrian civil wars, leaves out the expansion of Russian political and military influence, leaves out Turkey's generally obnoxious behavior at home and abroad, the decay of Lebanon, the systemic repression of human rights in Egypt, the persistence of the Israel-Palestine conflict, all are left out. Even the intrusion of our peer rival, China, and its expanding economic and political influence in the Eastern Mediterranean should not be of vital interest to the United States. So compared to the past, our interests in the Eastern Mediterranean are, in my view, much narrower, and there is not a whole lot we stand to lose by disengaging more from this region. Nor is there much to be gained by greater engagement. I worked for many years, about 2 decades, on the Cyprus problem. And I contributed at one point in what I regarded at the time as a significant way toward finding a negotiated settlement back in 2014. Of course, the solution never came. And just 6 weeks ago, the key parties met under United Nations auspices and found that the circumstances for further negotiation were not promising. And that was no surprise. There is really very little that external diplomatic intervention can do to resolve that dispute. It's similarly true for a large number of the problems in the Eastern Mediterranean. I worked on a lot of them, including a lot of the security issues during my career. I don't think any of them is presently suitable for a high-level, serious US diplomatic effort to find solutions. They simply are not in any way amenable to resolution through diplomatic engagement. And I believe the Biden administration actually recognizes this. At least that's how I would read its actions up to this point. President Biden did not appoint a high-profile negotiator on the Israel-Palestine dispute. That's significant. And what did he do with Turkey? Turkey is central to any serious effort to address the issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, but President Biden did something rather surprising, although I agree with what he did. amid an already tense US-Turkish relationship, when the Erdogan government was sending out some kind of tentative feelers for improving its relations with Europe and the United States, the president decided to publicly refer to the Ottoman genocide of Armenians on Armenian Remembrance Day last April. I think this was the right thing to do, don't get me wrong, but it's not the right thing to do if what you want to do is engage Turkey in an effort to resolve the regional disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean. It creates an additional point of friction between the United States and Turkey traditionally has reacted to these kinds of designations with by retaliating against the countries that have referred to the Armenian genocide. So to conclude, I believe the US should rebalance its approach to the Eastern Mediterranean to focus on the three vital issues I listed: avoiding Greece-Turkey conflict, protecting Israel, and containing the terror threat. We could engage in other areas, and I think we in fact should, but that would not be through US leadership. That would be through multilateral schemes, through participating in initiatives that are led or coordinated with others. There would be no more American leadership in this region. In response to the violence sparked by our events in Jerusalem, that's exactly what we saw. The US engaged diplomatically behind the scenes. It's not clear how significant it was, but in the end, at least Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to give credit to Egypt for having arranged the ceasefire that is currently still being observed between Gaza and Israel. One possibility would be to reactivate the Middle East Quad or some other multilateral scheme in order to manage the situation in the Israel-Palestine dispute as long as a real solution remains outside of the realm of possibility. You know, I'm advocating disengagement in a region that I care about a lot. I worked there for almost 20 years in one capacity or another. My children grew up there. I have a lot of friends there. I care very deeply about this region. Why do I advocate this? Because I think it's the right thing for the United States. We have got to start paying a lot closer attention to to policy approaches that serve the interests of the American people. We have to be less reactive and less of a, you might call, global policeman rushing in to try to establish control over every situation that has the potential to damage American interests more severely. We are terribly overextended at this point, in my view, and we particularly have far too many security and military commitments. So I think we should be looking at the Eastern Mediterranean and other regions for restraint, for reducing our commitments. I think that we might see the Eastern Mediterranean and our already considerable disengagement from this region as a model. There are many places where we could apply it and where we could disengage dramatically, in my view. Afghanistan is the most obvious. The Middle East is another, and perhaps the Black Sea is yet another. I'm not an isolationist. I don't want you to think I'm an isolationist. I am quite deeply committed to the United States engagement in the world. I think we should maintain and possibly increase our commercial engagement, our multilateral and humanitarian engagement, perhaps even our diplomatic engagement in a focused way. I think we should really look for ways to increase, create new tools of global understanding and governance, something that we've been very loath to do over the last 20 years. We do, however, need to set priorities, especially in security policy. When we see a vortex of conflicting pressures and historical trends in the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean, we should try to understand how the situation affects American interests first and act in line with those interests. We should not have this strong impulse to step in the middle to establish a kind of situational dominance. So what happens when we leave a region or a situation? The outcome varies, and it's not always positive, but it is not usually as catastrophic as predicted by the foreign policy establishment, not at all. As the US has pulled back from the Persian Gulf, for example, Iran and Saudi Arabia have started talking again after a very long hiatus. And I have a feeling that the US role in that, in the Persian Gulf was one reason why they were not talking. As we have withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean, other states, and not only rival states, have stepped up their engagement, including France and a very, very re-energized Greece. New forms of cooperation often develop when the United States removes the security cap that it applies to regions. They don't always conform entirely with American interests, but they often align well enough for us to support them from behind without taking the leading role. In fact, diplomacy and compromise often fill the gap left by American military dominance. Not always, but often enough so that we should not be afraid of pulling away. We don't need to own every problem in the world or orchestrate every mess. And why would we want to? How does that actually advance the interests of America and Americans? I think we have a pretty substantial mess here at home that really demands our attention. We do, of course, need to focus on China and managing that relationship in a way that serves our interest in the 21st century. But there are huge issues that we need to address, and all engagement in all these regional conflicts does not help. We need to tackle climate change and pandemic disease and a huge array of new threats and challenges related to rapid technological development. Just to refer back to cyber, I don't think confrontation with Russia and China is the way to deal with cyber. I think, in fact, it may be the path away from dealing with cyber. But I admit that I'm in the minority when I say that. So, realism and restraint, these will be my concluding remarks. Disengaging from the Eastern Mediterranean and engaging more selectively in foreign and security affairs will help us to solidify the home front and address other overarching pressing challenges. It comes back to a degree to how we define American strength. For me, I look at this map of US military and security sort of commitments around the world and deployments, and I think, okay, yeah, this is an asset, but what kind of asset is it? In some cases, it's a toxic asset. In some cases, it is very much not in our national interest to sustain this footprint. Even our network of alliances, and I worked a lot in the alliance, the NATO alliance, and I believe in alliances, it is also a mixed bag. It should not be something that we embrace entirely on its own as though it is of just inherent value. We have to have an eye on it. Some of it may cost us more than it's worth. The true basis of American strength, after all, is right here at home in places like Tacoma, our vibrant, diverse, innovative society, a strong economy, a strong system of constitutional government, and an abundance of resources. This foundation of American strength is pretty seriously eroded and cracked, and we need to make fixing it and dealing with the serious global problems that confront us and the entire world our first and most consistent priority. So that concludes my remarks. I hope that they stimulated some reaction and maybe some questions. I realize I'm considered to be kind of on one end of the American foreign policy debate, but I think it's one that deserves a lot more attention and a lot more engagement. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Hey, so thank you, Ambassador Koenig, and now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Uhr, and he'll be in charge of posing some questions based on that really interesting talk. So thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much, Ambassador Koenig. This is a very interesting presentation and very thoughtful one. And I think there is a divide between there is often a divide between the practitioners of foreign policy who are on the implementation end of foreign policy making in the government, and then you have the theorists, right, who talk about realism, constructivism, liberalism, all these different concepts, yet they have very little, everyday experience with how foreign policy actually is implemented, how it's received on the other side of the table. So I think it's very good refreshing to hear someone who has actual experience talking about this perspective from a theoretical point of view with a coherent proposal in terms of where to go, how to change things from here. When I talk about foreign policy, I like historian of American foreign policy, Walter Russell Mead's 4 schools of thought. He talks about the Hamiltonian school, which is really emphasizes a strong government and importance of US commercial interests abroad. And then you have the Wilsonian school, which emphasizes the importance of human rights and democracy building abroad, kind of the idealists. And then you have the Jeffersonians, who are, I think, a form of realism, like the Hamiltonian school, but they are the type of realists who emphasize the importance of restraint, balance of power politics, disarmament, And they are very conscious about the importance of the implications of our foreign relations on our domestic politics. The quality of democracy is influenced by our perhaps extensionist foreign policy. If you have if you spend a lot on the military, and then you end up creating lots of debt, and then that creates a whole bunch of different dynamics for our domestic politics. And then you have the Jacksonians, which is more of the populist trait in American foreign policy. So if I am not mistaken, I think you are very close to the Jeffersonian school, which tends to emphasize the importance of restraint and very conscious about nation building at home, the quality of democracy at home, right? Jeffersonians, they don't necessarily disagree with the importance of democracy and human rights, but they don't think it's really feasible for the United States to play, this kind of role to promote it everywhere. Democracy is a fragile plant. You can't transplant it everywhere, right? That's kind of the idea. So with that preface, maybe I can start with my question, and then we have 3 more questions in the chat. I'm going to raise them as well. Would you say it's, some people criticize this new realist turn approach in foreign policy by saying that it's in a way justifying America turning back on its on the things that it created for decades, right? Leaving Afghanistan and leaving a lot of problems over there now by, after 19 years, right? A lot of people who cooperated with the United States are very vulnerable. Or we talk about women's rights, what may happen after the United States leaves Afghanistan. And similarly, you gave the examples of Libya and Syria, where one can argue, I think there was a lot of restraint in American foreign policy, yet very few people would say they were really successful foreign policy decisions, given their implications. So what do you think about this question of realism sometimes being used as a way to escape from the responsibility of dealing with what America has created over a long period of time abroad, whether it's after Vietnam, whether it's after Iraq, Afghanistan? We kind of go back to realism and say, yeah, let's just cut loose and go back home, without necessarily thinking about how do we actually keep ourselves a little accountable for what we may have created abroad.
I mean, it's an interesting argument. I think you have to really distinguish between those cases that you mentioned. Syria, for example, is a case in which we did very little. I'm among those who think that Obama was right, that actually the Pentagon was also right. They did not want to go in. There was really very little interest on the United States to become more directly involved in the Syria conflict. And of course, it was a disaster. It was a humanitarian disaster. I don't think that that is a result of American policy. I mean, it's quite, I think, unfair to say that some sin of omission, the failure of the United States to establish control over Syria, is somehow our fault. Libya is a messier question. I was much involved in the Libya operation. That was a disaster. I think when it comes to accountability, there are few presidents who have been as forthright as Obama in saying that Libya was a huge disaster, his worst decision. And the reason was not because we ought not to have done anything to protect civilians in Benghazi when Gaddafi's forces were advancing on the city and seriously threatening to cause a bloodbath. It was because this was a horrible case of mission creep where we very, very elegantly slid into a campaign to oust Gaddafi without any will whatsoever to fill the security gap once he was gone. So there I will accept that we didn't handle that well, and it was a consequence of, in some ways, our own decisions. I am not sure that that staying on longer would have been a better solution than just actually controlling mission creep, maybe internationalize the mission and negotiating at an earlier stage. Afghanistan's something else entirely. I mean, to argue that, I think you're absolutely right that we need, as we did in Vietnam, after a similarly disastrous and misconceived long-term American engagement, we need to take care of the people who worked with us. And I think you'll find in the Foreign Service that everybody agrees with that. And we will be, I think, ashamed if the United States does not do more to bring out people who worked with the United States government and US forces, and perhaps even NGOs and others, people who are very, very seriously exposed should events evolve as many people expect they will, and the Taliban essentially gains power throughout the country. However, it cannot be the solution that we just stay forever in a mission with no clear objective because we are there already. This is a very common argument that's used. This is what I would call doubling down. Typically, when you're doing something that is not productive, you double down, basically thinking that what you're doing is not applying enough resources. And we have gone through these double down cycles twice or three times in Afghanistan, and the outcome has always been the same. I was in NATO headquarters when we first transferred the leadership of ISAF to allies. Well, we began to get them more engaged around the country, and the United States kind of handed off half of the mission in Afghanistan to our NATO allies. And even in that period, let's say by 2005, it was clear that our mission was not going to succeed. I'm sorry that I was very actively engaged in supporting it, finding countries to contribute to it, kind of boosting it. But there were very, very serious signs of failure already back in 2005. And actually, it never got very much better. Even though we took American forces over 100,000 under Obama, the situation never really improved very much. So I would say to those who would criticize us for shirking our responsibilities, I would worry more about pulling away from the international system of sort of multilateral organizations and legal norms that we have long supported. That is the one element that we created in the post-war environment that is really of value. Also, some of our alliances are very much of value. So I'm not saying cast off our alliances, but be clear-headed about what is an alliance and what is not an alliance. What we have with Israel is not really an alliance. We are a guarantor of Israel. And we have what is called in the US sort of scheme of legislation, a strategic alliance with Israel. But it doesn't have any of the reciprocal obligations that you would expect from allies. And in fact, I think it's unfortunate that we call that an alliance and mix it up with things like the US-Japan alliance or NATO. They're very, very different animals.
So I'm going to go to the questions in the chat. I'm going to combine a couple of them in this case. So, you talked about different countries, perhaps thinking of them on a case-by-case basis. But we have some questions, perhaps maybe to think about the general global strategy. What would, realist, a restraint-based foreign policy look like? So from Professor John Lucas, we have, to what extent does the United States U.S. national interest include maintaining the current global order? Is it possible to reconcile the goal of maintaining the global order with a foreign policy of restraint? And perhaps maybe we can tie that to a question about Russia and China. The question is, I agree with you that US rational disengagement is good for the nation. Does that hold true for China and Russia? Or is there something they will gain by the US taking a backseat?
Yeah, good. Those are excellent questions. Is the US, maintaining the global order, much of which was very, very strongly built by the United States in the immediate Cold War period or immediate World War II period, and then again in the 1990s when much of this order was revised and renewed. Is that compatible with the approach of restraint? I would say yes. And the most simple way to explain why I say yes is because much of what we've done over the last 30 years by not applying a policy of restraint has actually undermined the global order. I don't think anything damaged the global order worse than the invasion of Iraq, probably. And it's arguable that many other things that we did were almost deliberately intended to undermine the global order. We created this system of the so-called rules-based global order, and then we spent about the last 20 years trying to evade those rules. And everybody who tried to create new rules was thwarted by the United States for the most part. We were extremely loath to allow ourselves to be bound by the rules which we tried to impose on others. This was most obvious, I guess, in the case of the International Criminal Court, where we basically wrote the Rome Statute, or at least negotiated very carefully on a Rome Statute which we could support, and then basically, most recently, threatened to sort of arrest the head of the International Criminal Court if she were to come to the United States because she dared to support an inquiry into Israeli war crimes. So, I mean, we have really taken this idea of supporting the global order to the opposite extreme. We are corrosive. I think nobody is more identified with the effort to undermine the global order than John Bolton, who was National Security Advisor under Trump, had been UN ambassador and all sorts of other senior positions in the US government. So yes, I think they are compatible. And in fact, if we were to think more in terms of rules-based arrangements, I think we would probably succeed because we're a highly influential country, but we so often resist compromise in the context of negotiating international agreements that we actually become something of a spoiler more than a builder. Will China and Russia take advantage of restraint? Of course, but the idea that we are sort of engaged in a Cold War where we need to confront them at every turn actually cedes to them the decision on where we're going to confront them. I mean, let's look at the Black Sea. I think it's somewhat tragic that we have built up Ukraine to be the champion of our of democracy. First of all, the country has huge problems, but that's not my main problem. The issue is that any realistic confrontation between Russia and the United States over Ukraine is going to lead to Russia's win. Russia is going to be victor. We cannot extend our influence that close to Russia's borders and expect that we will not be confronted with very serious challenges from the other side. The same thing applies, in my view, to Taiwan. We need to think very seriously about all of these calls to clarify our defense commitment to Taiwan, to abandon what has long been called strategic ambiguity, the sort of language of the Taiwan Relations Act, and instead fully endorse a policy of defense of Taiwan. It's highly provocative from the point of view of China. I don't think we're very committed to the policy. In all honesty, I think we would not prevail in a conflict over Taiwan. And why would we do it? I mean, what is the U.S. government, or what is the U.S. people's interest in fighting a war over Taiwan? I know this might sound like appeasement, but we do need to be much more careful about where we choose to confront and where we choose to cooperate and where we choose to negotiate. And we have been far too confrontational in our approach for quite a while, in my view, and we ought to be serious about seeking cooperation and negotiating agreements.
I know we're running a little short on time. We have a few questions about Israel. One of them is saying from Leon Halsa, how does our re-engagement with Iran link to your second and third vital US interest in the Eastern Mediterranean? Is there reason for hope, or would you describe that conundrum as another situation, not really amendable to diplomatic efforts led by the United States? We have Amelia Hagen's question. Still with the goal of protecting Israel, how would you envision a more normal, less special US relationship with Israel? In your view, is the current administration moving in that direction? And Nancy Nainhouse asks, what are your feelings about the success of the possible coalition government in Israel? How do you see the addition of an Arab influence in Israeli policy?
Yeah, those are all excellent. I would say I think we should very seriously pursue whatever possibility exists to restore the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and then get on with work on additional elements if they're possible. I know Tom knows this issue much better than I do, Tom Kumpterman, but it seems to me that at the very least, we need to get back into a framework where there's where we can be confident that there will be IAEA presence and control within the old scheme, and maybe that we can also get the Iranians to give up a lot of their enriched uranium again and go back to a posture that they were more or less in at when we exited the JCPOA. They were very gradual in their ramping up, and I do worry that time is very short because of the elections that are coming in Iran. But I think we should definitely try. And after that, I think we should work very closely with partners to see whether it's not possible to extend agreements that would cover sort of support for insurgent groups and other groups outside of Iran in the Middle East and more broadly, and also more stronger control on missiles and other delivery systems. What would a more normal relationship with Israel look like? That's a very good question. A person who I greatly admire, Stephen Walt, just wrote an article about this that was in the Foreign Policy yesterday or today, so I would have a look at that if you can. But I would say a more normal relationship would be one that enabled us to go back to where we were for a very long time, where we could actually criticize Israel, where we did not defend everything that Israel did in the Security Council, as we just did within the last month, twice vetoing resolutions that would have criticized Israel for its behavior and the civilian casualties that were caused in the Gaza Strip. And would also, by the way, these statements have condemned Hamas. So we should do that. I think we should probably not continue with the assistance that we give them, although that's rather immaterial. The $3-some billion is a drop in the bucket for Israel and the United States. But I think the notion that this is just fixed in our assistance program is not necessary, and it also doesn't mean a whole lot to Egypt. Certainly doesn't seem to influence the behavior of either of those countries at all. And you know, I think we should encourage Israel to find a more, I think, sustainable approach to the issues that everybody recognizes. What is going to happen as the Palestinian population grows and becomes a potentially even majority in the territory of Israel? How is Israel going to sustain democracy with a Palestinian population that's not 10 or 15%, but is 20, 30% or conceivably more? We should also, I think, take a different approach to settlements, one that we've never really pursued with any seriousness. But as Stephen Walt points out, our devotion to alignment with Israel, especially as Israel has drifted to the right into more nationalistic positions, has been a great disadvantage for us in the region. It has tended to undermine the sense that the United States is anything but loyal to Israel. The idea that we are actually acting on principle is seriously compromised by the devotion that we have to protecting Israel from international criticism. So as far as the new government, I mean, as a Democrat and as an American, I'm just delighted to see Netanyahu go out the door. Good riddance. This man has been very bad for U.S.-Israel relations and has been very bad, I think, for the region and for Israel in the long run. So I'm delighted to see him go. I know that the coalition that is possibly going to oust him from power is a frail one, but hopefully he'll be convicted and sent to prison before he has a chance to run again.
A lot of people still have a hard time believing that Netanyahu is going to be going. So we should probably
we'll see. Well, I hope he doesn't blame me for my prison comment.
we have one last question, and it's, I think, a very good question to end this conversation, maybe to talk a little bit more about the domestic politics front. Natasha's question is, if a democratic administration were to enact your recommendations by disengaging in areas that do not directly further US interests, how would that administration justify these actions to a liberal base?
I don't think, that's an interesting question. I don't think that the US actually, I don't think US foreign policy has much link to popular views, to be honest. Certainly when the United States is engaged in war, there's a tendency to rally to the flag. That I will grant you. But I'm not sure that many people would really notice if we were to sort of downgrade our level of engagement in a large number of the places where we're currently engaged, because they don't know that we're there anyway. What we will probably find is much more of a problem is that a lot of people who care a lot about humanitarian intervention would find that we were less prone to undertake intervention, military intervention for humanitarian reasons. But we haven't done that much lately. We have, that was a tradition that sort of ended to a large measure during the Obama administration and really didn't happen during the Trump administration. And I can hardly imagine that people want us to bring it back. One area that I would think we should definitely reconsider, and this will be highly unpopular with a lot of people who are active in foreign policy, is our addiction to sanctions. We like to sanction everybody for everything. We have more sanctions in place. In fact, much of my job, I don't know if this was true for Tom as well, but a lot of my job was about sanctions. Now, there are different kinds of sanctions. There are sanctions that are intended to actually curtail dangerous activity. And Tom was more involved in a lot of those. They're very specific. They go after very, very sort of identifiable behavior, especially with regard to weapons proliferation and terrorism and so forth, that are easily sanctioned. And there's a broad international agreement for the most part to take on these kind of sanctions. But lately we've been really, I would say, intoxicated with the notion of punitive sanctions over a wide range of policy problems, including human rights, but also any number of other things. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example, in the Baltic. This wide application of sanctions, I think, is directly detrimental to the global order that we were talking about. It usually relies on exploitation of the special place of the US economy and the US dollar in international exchange. And I think that we should really, restraint would require that we relinquish some of these sort of sticks that we use through sanctions, so-called muscular or coercive diplomacy, and instead talk and listen. How about listen a little bit?
Hey, well, thank you. I think that's our last question. We've gone a little bit over, but we had a lot of interest, so we felt like it was okay. But thank you, Ambassador Koenig. You know, as Etka pointed out when he first started talking, it's a treat to hear from someone who knows about the real experience of working practically on these issues and also has thought about the theories and the ideas behind them. And I might add to that, is able to present them in such a way that really pushes us to challenge a lot of those assumptions that we just sort of unquestionably go along with. And so you've given us all a lot to think about in a very interesting way. So thank you very much. And thank all of you for coming to hear this very interesting presentation by Ambassador Koenig.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. I'm still on, but we're just kind of gradually closing it out here.
Ambassador, could I ask you just one question, or is there, we have any more questions?
No, I'm happy to. I mean, I don't have anything at 8. So
I was just very concerned about a comment that you made about a country, not in the Middle East, but a country, Taiwan. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Taiwanese living in this country. And with all due respect, it was kind of like it was put down, like forget about it. And I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong on that, Ambassador, and I really apologize if I am, but there are so many Taiwanese in our region, in our country, and I don't know if they would like to have heard what you mentioned about their country.
I'm sorry about that, but I just, and I didn't tailor my comments as a put down or anything about Taiwan. I just don't think that it's worth a war with China. And I think, in all honesty, the United States would not go to war over Taiwan with China. That's my honest assessment. That doesn't mean we don't like Taiwan or that we're selling them down the tube. But I think it's important to bear in mind the commitments we undertook when we established relations with China, and also the power differential in the waters around Taiwan. We could lose tens of thousands of American lives trying to defend Taiwan. I think you must appreciate that. I'm not sure that that is something that the American people should be expected to shoulder. I'm also not sure that there's going to be a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. There's much discussion of how likely is this thing. Certainly, the Xi Jinping government does tend to want to put more pressure on Taiwan, with the notion being, I guess,